Don is president of Temple Scott Associates, and he leads its national government relations practice. He's a lawyer with over 20 years of experience. He's consistently recognized as one of Canada's top lobbyists in the Hill Times. Don has created successful government relations programs for major global companies like Salesforce, MasterCard, Emirates Airline, and Vanguard, as well as industry associations. His expertise covers financial services, taxation, transportation, healthcare, and product law. He advises clients on House of Commons and Senate procedures, lobbying, legislation, and crisis communications. Don also delivers executive seminars and training on lobbying, advocacy, and parliamentary committee appearances. He holds a law degree and a master's degree in economics from Queen's University. He's joining us remotely from Ottawa. Please give him a warm Saskatchewan welcome. Over to you, Don.
Good morning, everyone. Everyone can hear me well?
Yes,
Great.
we can. Yep.
Okay. Apologies for not being there in person. I have a very strong connection to the province. My wife was born and raised there. I've spent a lot of time in Saskatchewan, so very sorry I couldn't have made it out again. Well, you've picked a pretty interesting time to have an update on political events and effective lobbying strategies. I don't think we foresaw, Curtis, that we'd be in this exact moment when we picked this topic, but I'm very happy to be here. Next slide. So today I want to spend about 20 to 25 minutes providing an update on two things. I'll go through a little bit of a political overview / election update, and then I'll provide like 7 very practical principles for effective lobbying, and you can think these through, and hopefully they'll sort of think through how your organization would implement them in your lobbying strategy, both federally, provincially. These are transferable principles. And then the rest of the time, I'm happy to have a discussion or take questions. Next slide. So I've been lobbying for a long time. I don't want to give away my age. And I do not remember a time quite like this. If you look back less than 2 months ago, most polls would have had the Conservatives at a 20-point lead. Certainly prior to Christmas, all of the polls would have had the Conservatives at a 20-point lead in federal election polling, or federal polling, sorry, political polling. And people would be sort of prognosticating, well, are the Conservatives going to get 200 seats or 250 seats? What's going to be the size of their majority? And that wasn't 1 or 2 people. That was pretty much the consensus view of people that are paid to watch these things, of the lobbying community. And I would say, you know, 2 things really caused a seismic shift. Obviously, the departure of Justin Trudeau and the entrance of Donald Trump onto the Canadian political scene. And what that's done is really transformed what pollsters like to call the ballot box question from one that was exclusively on affordability and change, and one that was really almost at this point in the election campaign exclusively focused on who Canadians feel is best placed to manage Canada through what is an existential crisis in our relationship with our major trading partner and ally. Next slide. So I like to look at a site, and many people look at a site called 338canada.com. They do an aggregator of current polling. They do seat projections. And so if you look at the last 15 polls released since Mark Carney took over as leader of the Liberal Party, what you've seen as a trend that started in terms of a narrowing of the lead, the Conservative lead in the polls that started around the beginning to mid-February, has now seen that the large majority of polls show the Liberals now in the lead nationally in election campaigns. The little icon in the top is the average of the polls as of about late last week. So at this point, I think the polls are volatile, is what I would say. A lot can happen over the course of the campaign, but aggregators pretty much have the Liberals winning a slim majority if the polls hold steady, and they're correct right now. But from my perspective, it really is anybody's race between the Conservatives and the Liberals. It's not clear to me whether we're going to have a minority or majority parliament. But at this point, I would say unless something dramatically changes, and I know we have an NDP MLA in the audience, the NDP is facing almost certain losses, as is the Bloc in Quebec. And something pretty significant would have to change in the electoral landscape, which, if we've learned anything from the past 6 weeks, we know that's possible. Next slide. Mark Carney's come in as the new prime minister, new Liberal leader, has really won that pretty decisively, was no question. He spent a week being prime minister before he called the election and did quite a few things. I would say what he really did was respond to the success of Pierre Poilievre in terms of creating a number of issues for the Liberals that were toxic with the electorate. So he ended the carbon tax, at least the consumer-facing portion of it, as well as the promised capital gains increases from the Liberal 2024 budget. He sees the winning strategy of comparing Poilievre to Trump, emphasizing his experience in dealing with crisis situation. His major Achilles heel at this, he's completely untested as a retail politician, and running an election campaign and having debates as a politician are much different than having debates and conversation and answering media questions when you're the governor of the Bank of Canada or the Bank of England. And this will be his real crucible test. Next slide. So in some ways, I would argue that Pierre Poilievre has been almost too successful. He was very successful at critiquing Justin Trudeau and positioning him as a tired leader who was out of ideas and out of touch with where Canadians were in terms of the things that were impacting their daily lives. And lo and behold, Justin Trudeau exited the scene. He made the carbon tax politically toxic for all federal parties, at least the consumer-facing portion of it, except the Green Party. And lo and behold, that was eliminated before he could get to an election. And then he's really had to adjust to the fact that I mentioned earlier that prior to Donald Trump's inauguration, the ballot box question was affordability, which is an issue that he has owned as a politician. And now the ballot box question is shifting. So Poilievre's test is, I would argue, threefold. He needs to close the gap with Mark Carney and Canadians' perceptions minds of who's best to deal with Trump. And you see him trying to do that, particularly last night with his response to Trump's tariffs on autos. I think he was particularly effective at doing that. He needs to remind Canadians that they actually care about affordability. So have that as a ballot box issue for a significant number of Canadians. And I think he needs to push this message for change and sort of resist the urge of remind Canadians that Mark Carney's actually running as a Liberal prime minister and that Liberals have been in power for 10 years. And can Canadians really trust the Liberals to make all the changes that Canadians want to see in terms of some of the fundamental policies? Next slide. It's really impossible to underestimate the impact that Donald Trump has had on our election campaign. You know, he was quiet in terms of focus on Canada for about 72 hours. And then we got the press conference yesterday at 4 p.m. announcing that he was putting a 25% tariff on autos. No one's even fully sure yet, I don't think, of what that means. It's due to take effect next Wednesday. That Trump is going to continue to be, I think, the factor through the election campaign and will loom large over its result. Next slide. Okay, so most importantly for us, what's next? So the House of Commons has been dissolved, as probably many of you know, since December well, it hasn't sat since December 20th. I think it was effectively prorogued January 6th. So in one of the biggest crises in our country, we haven't had a sitting parliament. That almost guarantees that no matter who's prime minister after April 28th, they'll quickly recall the House. So they'll have to appoint a cabinet. I would say that's likely to happen within 2 weeks after the election date. If the Conservatives win, it may take a bit longer to appoint the cabinet. No matter who's elected, we'll quickly see a recall of Parliament and a throne speech that will lay out the priorities of the government. We'll see a full-on budget or a mini budget delivered prior to June 30th. No doubt a legislative package to respond to the ongoing situation with the US. A Conservative government will undoubtedly, as their first piece of legislation, introduce a bill to scrap sorry, I forget the formal name, but the legislation that enacts the carbon tax. I'm not going to come up with the name off the top. I'm sorry, it's just escaped me. But they will almost certainly do that as well. Next slide. So for you, there's a number of issues to consider, but obviously the carbon tax and fuel exceptions, and the carbon tax, at least the consumer-facing portion, will be repealed. Beyond that, the Liberals and Conservatives offer very different views of how they're going to approach the environment and climate change and how they actually are going to repeal the carbon tax, and I can take questions on that. The tariffs will continue to dominate the political conversation and legislative and policy agenda here in Ottawa, and they have significant impacts on you, I would guess. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the ongoing trade relationship with China, and obviously that has an impact on you, I'm sure, as well. So that's my political update. I will really want to switch now to a little presentation on effective lobbying. Next slide, sorry. Oh, I apologize. So some tips for you in terms of the election environment. Obviously, your ability to contact, like I would encourage you to do outreach in this time, and I'm sure you already are, with candidates from all parties. Obviously, in Saskatchewan, the Conservatives have dominated for a long time on the federal scene, the political environment, and I would expect to see a large contingent of Conservative MPs from Saskatchewan. But I wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket, and I'll come to that. You can invite the candidates to tour your farm. You can ask them to champion the issues that are most important to you. Essentially, there's probably never a more important time where your member of parliament is going to be eager to solve your issues than an election campaign, because they want your vote. In addition, I would highly recommend that you don't just focus on local candidates. Always helps to engage with party leaders and platform and campaign teams. You could do that as APAS. I know that the CFA is doing that. I know that you work quite well with the CFA, so you could do it in conjunction with other stakeholders, and I'm going to get to that in my lobbying tips. And I would point out that if you look at the site I mentioned earlier, 338canada.com, currently the Liberals are projected to win the riding of the northern riding descent, I'm going to mispronounce it, Mississippi and Churchill River. It's been redrawn, and based on the redesigned boundaries, at least at this point in the campaign, the Liberals are projected to win that riding. Regina, Wascana is the next most competitive riding according to that site, but it's still projected to be a Conservative held riding if the polls remain the same, which they are unlikely to. Okay, sorry about that. Next slide. So after the election, you need to be prepared for whoever forms government, and I'll get into how to do that in my tips. If it's the Conservatives or the Liberals that form government, they're going to have very different priorities. So you're going to want to spend some time thinking about how you're going to align your priorities with the government's priorities. That's the secret sauce of government relations and advocacy. And you're going to have to prepare for either a majority or minority environment. Either scenario is quite possible right now. And spoiler alert, at this point, it's likely that the Bloc will hold the balance of power in any minority parliament. And that has fundamental implications for how a minority parliament would run compared to a minority parliament where the NDP held the balance of power. Next slide. Okay, so sometimes I have 6. I decided to have 7 key principles for effective lobbying, and these are the 7. I'll go through each one in a little bit more detail. So next slide. So a little challenge for everybody. If you know the third person on the this slide, you get bonus points. I'll give a few hints as we go along. But essentially, effective government relations is all about building capital and then leveraging that capital when you need it. So it's very hard to work with clients. It's hard for any organization to lobby for significant change when they're a completely unknown entity with the organizations that they're, or the individuals that they're lobbying. So good lobbying is about having trust and credibility with all parties, with the public service, at least awareness, and then using that trust and credibility to leverage results when you need them. Organizations that try to sit today and say, well, the polls are projecting a Mark Carney majority, so we're just going to focus on the Liberals, often find themselves surprised and playing catch up after election day. Organizations that have spent the past year only lobbying the Conservatives are suddenly having to pretty dramatically switch their strategy. So that's probably, like, if history tells us the future, that's a good historical lesson. And don't forget the public service. Especially under a Liberal government, they are going to be important in terms of policy development and options for policy. So good organizations don't just focus on either the political level or only government ministers and MPs. They focus on all parties, all MPs, as well as all relevant government departments. Next slide. So as I was sort of mentioning before, if you're going into a government or a political party and you're talking to them about an issue that's your priority but isn't a priority for them, you're creating a problem for them. So the key to government relations is taking your issue and convincing the politician or the public service that it's their issue and it aligns, what you're trying to get them to do aligns with what they were already trying to do. That's not possible in all cases, and we can get to that, but that's certainly the easiest way to drive change. Governments have much different priorities than opposition parties, so your message has to change for each. That goes without saying. Often individual ministers have different priorities within a cabinet. Certainly the caucus can have different priorities, so you have to understand that. And definitely the department will have different priorities in terms of how they operate and serve their ministers than the political level, and definitely than caucus members. Next slide. So, okay, how do you identify these priorities? Well, in today's day and age, it's become relatively easy. Certainly under the Liberal government, mandate letters for ministers have been made public. Under Harper's government, there were mandate letters, but they weren't publicized. They were harder to get. So if the mandate letters are made public, that's a very good way to understand what the priorities of the government are. And then conversely, if the Prime Minister is writing to you and you're the Minister of Agriculture and he says, Cody, I want you to get the following 6 things done, they pretty quickly go up the priority list for Cody when he takes over as Minister of Agriculture. Committee hearings are another way to get a really good handle on what are priorities for individual members of Parliament for different parties. Throne speeches give you a good overview of government priorities. Budgets basically set the priorities of the government, and the reaction to them tells you a lot about what the opposition is interested in focusing on and critiquing. If you really want to understand where the opposition's at, question period will give you a really good sense of their day-to-day priorities. And of course, we'll have formal election platforms released within the next week to 10 days, and that provides you a really good understanding of what the priorities of any party is going to be when Parliament returns. Next slide. So probably one of the biggest problems I see with a lot of stakeholders is that they don't really understand the decision-making process. And it's not really a transparent process in government, and it really varies depending on who is government. So if you're interested in lobbying on an issue, you have to understand who's responsible for the final decision. Is this an issue that the PMO and the Prime Minister is engaging on? Is it something that's really going to cabinet for a vigorous debate? Is it something that the minister themselves has the leeway to decide? Who's influencing that decision? Is it a minister that's very reliant on their department and ministerial staff for advice? Are they reliant on the public service? This will vary depending on party in power, on the prime minister and their management style, on the minister themselves, how closely they do or don't listen to caucus. Obviously, other third parties that are interested in the decision. And then how opposition can or can't influence the decision. And then strategically, whether you do or don't want to use opposition critics as a way leverage a decision in your favor. And that can really depend on how you see the issue progressing within government and whether drawing attention to it brings more pros than cons. I think the other main thing I would say is people often don't match the level of lobbying to the timeline. And so timelines for decision, two things. Usually in government, they take a lot longer than stakeholders would like. Sometimes they do not. When government wants to, they can act extremely quickly. But more importantly, you have to match your level of lobbying to the actual timeline. And so sometimes people miss the actual timeline for decision and they're lobbying after a decision's been made. Sometimes they're too early and it's just not a priority for the people that they're lobbying. And so understanding what the timelines are on an ongoing basis is incredibly important in terms of developing an effective strategy. Next slide. Another error, in my opinion, that a lot of organizations make is that they lobby on too many issues or they don't make it clear to decision makers what priorities, what their priorities are and how they would rank their priorities. People that go in with 10 asks to a meeting, they just lose the plot. It's too hard for decision makers to understand. If you're getting a half hour with the minister and you're raising more than 3 things max, you're doomed to fail in that meeting. So really understanding what is a priority for your organization, benchmarking your priorities on an ongoing basis, and then making sure that your lobbying efforts match the level of priority that you have to a specific issue is important. Governments, at the end of the day, for the most part, want to try and address stakeholder concerns for the most part. And so if they really don't understand what your most important issue is, they might be moving on an issue that's not as important to you as they think it is. The other thing is, if you're always in asking for 15 things and you're never happy, it really makes it hard to deal with an organization, quite frankly, for any party, whether that's opposition, government, public service. Next slide. So obviously, there's what I would call safety in numbers. It's always good to bring a solution to government that's widely supported. Some governments don't require that as much as others, but all governments like to understand that they're on relatively safe terrain when possible. I know from meeting Curtis and speaking with Curtis that you work quite often with the CFA, which I think is important. It's really hard for decision makers to move when they feel there's not consensus within a certain sector. that's the reality of life, but where there is consensus, it makes it easier. Don't forget about your provincial government. They could be quite effective advocates for you, even if the government is of a different stripe. If you can think of other creative industry alliances, different industries that would support your point of view, if there's effective user groups of your products. I mean, where you can find alliances and engage alliances, they're useful. I think a little tip I would give is don't. Sometimes people develop a formal alliance and they think, right, the alliance is lobbying, so I don't have to. And then the alliance loses its effectiveness because people forget how broad the alliance is. So if you get into formal alliances, it's important to make sure that the government decision makers understand how broad the alliance is, that you're a member of it, and that you're actively lobbying and in support of what the alliance is trying to achieve. Next slide. As I was saying, timelines in government can be very long. Unfortunately, I guess it's job security in my business, but sometimes things that should take months can take years. And so you really have to be persistent and disciplined. The worst thing you could do as a lobbying effort, in my opinion, is to decide that you're going to really throw a lot of resources at lobbying, get a positive decision in the timeline that you were hoping for. You drop that campaign for a year or two. You come back a year or two later and decide you really need to throw a lot of resources at that campaign, do another round of blitzkrieg lobbying, drop it for another year. You lose all the momentum that you're building. Decision makers in government change quite rapidly. So I think it's really important to understand that most times it's going to take longer to get somewhere than you would want. You don't want to be pouring good money after bad or good effort after bad. So it is important within that journey to have benchmarks that you're seeing and progressing past. But you shouldn't view victory in a sort of go, no go decision. Good campaigns understand that if you're making progress along the way, it's worth it to continue to invest. Next slide. I guess the last thing I would say, I think this is the last one, is that politicians, an average day in a federal MP's life, they're probably going to have 8 to 10 meetings in that day, or 8 to 10 engagements. And so you could be very effective and get the attention of the minister, the ministerial staffer, the member of parliament, and they could definitely be swayed by your arguments. But someone could be coming in the next day or the day after and make equally effective arguments opposed to your proposal or policy. So it's really important to understand who is out there arguing against what you're trying to achieve and what are their arguments in opposition, what arguments are effective with different levels of government. Are there certain arguments that are very effective with the public service? Are there certain arguments that are resonating with the minister or elements of caucus? And how can you address those arguments? How can you modify your campaign, either tactically or your messaging, to address it? So it's competitive intelligence. It's actually somewhat easy to do. You can monitor committee agendas to see who's making presentations at committee. You could read the Hill Times. Often it becomes apparent who's lobbying on various issues. The lobbyist registry is a great tool to understand who's out there lobbying on various issues. So good campaigns really understand the environment that they're walking into in terms of the competing pressures that decision makers have. I believe that's the presentation. Next slide. So happy to take questions, go to a discussion. I think we have 15 more minutes, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Don. We do have time for some questions. If there are any, make your way to the mic. Don, I do have one. You mentioned some of the considerations that you have to take into account when you're thinking about how to engage opposition critics. I've certainly seen that over many years involved in public policy. Sometimes there's hesitancy to engage opposition critics. What's your advice on what are those considerations you have to take into account, and how do you navigate that?
Right. So I think it's important to engage all political parties on an ongoing basis. I think what you have to understand is you really need to understand as you're communicating with the opposition members, what are they looking to get out of that? Some opposition members want to use you for information about how things are going with the government, and you need to think carefully through your answers because they may then just walk into question period and surprise the minister. I would say when you develop a good relationship with the opposition, you can actually say to them, look, we're just briefing you about this. For the time being, things are going well. We don't need you to raise this in committee, or it might cause problems if you do. Some critics respond very well to that. Others sort of feel like, well, that's my business. So you just have to go in with eyes wide open. Anything that you're telling to an opposition critic could end up at question period later in the day, often does, could be the topic of a committee study. And so then you need to weigh the pros and cons of how hard you want to brief the opposition on certain topics, whether you actually think having it raised in question period would benefit you versus not benefit you, and recognizing that once you speak to critics, you kind of lose control about what they're going to do with the information. That's part of the kind of risks. I wouldn't say risk, that's just the reality of dealing with it. But the more you speak with critics, usually the better working relationship you can have, and they would be they'd be responsive to requests where you say, look, could you actually have write the minister a letter or have a quiet word with them, versus, oh, we'd like to have a committee study on this and bring some scrutiny to the issue. You don't get to control that, but if you develop good relations, you could sometimes have some influence on how the critics or parties are going to utilize the information they're getting from you.
Thank you for that. I think we have at least one question at the mic, so go ahead.
I was just going to jump in on that. As an opposition MLA, our policy with the Saskatchewan NDP is anytime you come and talk to us, we won't go public with that information. That means not raising it in question period or doing petitions on it without your permission. We really value anytime you come to discuss what's going well, but also what's not going well, and keeping us informed. And so it's very important to us that we understand you have a relationship with government. You need to keep that relationship positive. And so we won't take any action without first consulting you and getting your permission. And we can also get your issues heard through other means too. We might connect you with media or some other sources to raise your issue without it relating directly to you, and kind of helping tell your story that way. So at least as far as the Saskatchewan NDP is concerned, we maintain that confidentiality and really value that positive relationship.
Thank you for that. Over to the other mic.
I just wanted to say, because I don't want to give the wrong impression. I mean, my expertise is mostly federal. I really am happy to hear that answer. And I would say that is generally the way critics deal with stakeholders, but that's not always the way it is, at least federally. So I just sort of want people to be aware of that, but I really think that's fantastic, that perspective.
Agreed. Over to the other mic, Ian.
Thanks for your presentation, Don. Ian Boxall with APAS. You touched on the elected. How important is it that the senators understand the issues that we're facing in agriculture and lobbying?
No, thanks for raising that. And I didn't really focus on that in the presentation, so thanks for giving me an opportunity. I would say, I'm sure you've noticed that for traditionally, the Senate has been very short on representatives that really understood agriculture, and that's changing in a hurry recently, much to the benefit. Senators, because they don't have constituency responsibilities, they are at the legislative level, can dig much deeper during committee hearings or through their processes to raise attention to issues to be influential in terms of bringing attention either through a Senate committee hearing, Senate questions. Some of them have decent working relationships with the public sector, as well as the various ministers. The other thing is senators are there until they're 75, so they don't come and go with election cycles, and they tend to, once they get a hold of an issue, can champion it over longer periods of time. So effective strategies have consider how to take advantage of that, and I would highly encourage engagement with senators. So thank you for saying that. I would point out that the Senate has been radically reformed. So except for conservative senators, the Senate used to sit within caucus, so they'd have great opportunities to dialogue regularly with their House of Commons counterparts, including ministers, if they were in the governing caucus. But except for the conservative caucus, that doesn't happen anymore. And so the Senate as a body has changed quite dramatically with the various groups within the Senate, but that's like a much more detailed answer. As a high principle, I think, especially for your group, and especially now, the Senate can be a very influential and effective body to help you raise issues.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Jared Gus, Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. I was wondering if you could maybe give us some insight on lobbying foreign governments, China, US, India. How do we deal with them as specific crop commissions or the farm lobby as in general? Like, is there a role for us? Should we be going to the embassies, the high commissions, the local consulates? Any insight? Thank you.
Great. So just by way of background, I've actually had the benefit of going, we work with some global companies and they bring in lobbyists from around the world to have discussions about lobbying in different jurisdictions. And I could definitely say I wouldn't have any great advice about how to lobby the Chinese government. I mean, their system is so different. But as a general principle, I think working with foreign affairs and our embassies based in their capital is a very effective way to have influence. Most embassies see that as part of their job to help connect organizations from Canada with the proper levels or to represent you and your interests. The embassy in Washington is very effective at that, obviously. Then lobbying and engaging with ambassadors here in Canada for the governments is also very effective. Obviously, they see their roles, and I deal with a lot of them as representing their industry to the Canadian government. So they might be less interested in trying to help you lobby your perspective into their government. But certainly there could be opportunities in terms of helping resolve trade disputes, getting insights and perspectives and information from them. Then I guess the other thing I would say is, unfortunately, you know, the US system of government is very different than the Canadian system. So you might want to actually engage representation in Washington that have that expertise on your behalf. That's something I wouldn't do lightly. But, you know, if you're not finding that our embassy in Washington is doing enough or keeping you informed or helping you get the right meetings, then that's something you might want to consider. If you're looking at Washington, I would also look at consul general's offices in major cities, because state lobbying could also be extremely effective in terms of raising your issue. And like we were saying, trying to build third-party supporters for your message that can advocate within the federal government to say, look, this is a really harmful policy to our state. Those are other strategies I'd pursue.
Thanks, Don. We have one last question from Norm.
Norm Hall, APAS. You went around it a number of times, but you didn't actually come out and say it. You talked about how long policy takes to develop, and you said to avoid the blitzkrieg, but also avoid the big gaps. So it's slow and steady wins the race, of course, but hopefully you win. But it's all about relationships, and whether it's opposition, those in government power, or bureaucrats. it's all about, it's about who you know, not necessarily what you know. And it's just a constant, whether it's a once a week or once a month, text, email, or phone call visit that gets you where you're going. And it's all about building trust. So they know what you want, you know where your organization is going, and why you need this, and if you can answer all of that plus some of the questions that your critics have, then you can be successful. But it like you said earlier, it's a long, slow process to get policy changed.
Yeah, I agree 1,000% with that. I hope that was kind of one of the key themes I wanted to get across. And if you go back to from my first tip, I mean, every organization has to build awareness, trust, and credibility before they could start making progress on what they want to achieve from a policy or regulatory perspective. And you do that on an ongoing basis. So it's building political capital and then drawing down on that political capital over time. Unfortunately, decision makers at all levels of government change fairly regularly: ministerial staffers, cabinet shuffles, the public service. So there's sort of built-in ongoing brand building, is what I would call it, that you need to do in order to make progress and headway on the issues which, as you said, unfortunately take longer than people would expect.
And I lied, Don. There's one last question. So I think I'm telling the truth this time.
Vicki Dutton, Dutton Farms. Can you give us a report card of how you think ag is doing? In this room, we represented associations that collect millions of dollars from farmers that are invested in representing farmers. I certainly have been somewhat skeptical that we're spending enough money on lobbying and communication of how we do. And I do know when we fought CN and CP for service for years, we were told how many lobbyists they have and how many lobbyists we didn't have. So if you could just do a bit of a report card, could we do better? Thank you.
I will tell you, I'm a big fan of the CFA and the team here. I know them all. We work on their Hill Day. We don't work with them on an ongoing basis. But I think that they're very professional. They do a lot of the things that I mentioned in terms of they build awareness and trust with the public service, with senators, with ministers, with members from all parties. They don't make a lot of mistakes. I think the challenge for ag, right, if I'm going to speak candidly, is sometimes ag, it's just a reality of your business. You're not united in terms of the priorities, and that's to be expected. So then, unfortunately, Ottawa tends to look at you as a sector, and yes, you are, but the sector within, like the industry within the sector, can have very different priorities. So as your organization, I think you need to assess, well, where's the CFA? Like, where are you aligned with them? Where maybe do you need to spend resources moving on very specific issues to your organization? You know, in terms of hiring a lobbyist, I would really shy away from hiring people that you think have a good Rolodex only. They should be substantial as well. I mean, in our business, if someone knows me, they're going to pick up the phone faster when I call or send an email. Same with my colleagues. But if I'm always, if I'm not telling them things that align with what they're trying to do, my calls will stop getting returned pretty fast, same as you. So be careful about like retaining lobbyists. And I say that like no matter who you hire, it's not just about how many you have, it's about how effective you are. So those would be my comments. I mean, if you have a really specific issue you want to raise, I could be more granular than that.
That was great. Thank you very much, Don. Let's give a round of applause to say thanks. All right, it's time for lunch. Lunch is complimentary thanks to the generosity of the sponsor groups today. However, there will be buckets. So if you have money you're willing and able to donate, it's going to the wonderful organization of agriculture in the classroom, one that we can all proudly support. So a complimentary lunch, but certainly feel free to make donations to Ag in the Classroom, and we'll see you back here. Lunch is served just outside the doors, I understand. We'll see you back after lunch.